It's a tough road ahead, but I'm confident that we can find success together. Senator Sanders.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much for holding this hearing, and Director Mulvaney, thanks very much for being with us this morning. I don't have to tell anybody that in America today, there is a lot of political demoralization. Congress is held at one of the lowest today favorable levels at any time in history. The vast majority of the people think we do a terrible job. President Trump's favorable ratings are the lowest, I believe, for any president who has served the length of time that he has served. So people look at Washington and they don't see much that they feel very good about. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that, which this budget really demonstrates. Number one, there are politicians who run for office and they say one thing. President Trump, when he was a candidate, ran for office and he said, I'm a different type of Republican. I'm not the Mick Mulvaney type of Republican, I'm different. I'm going to stand with working families, we're going to take on the establishment, and so forth and so on. Well, it turns out he did exactly the opposite, and this budget is a clear manifestation of him doing exactly the opposite. And second of all, I think what the American people understand is their one vote, their one voice matters relatively little in a Congress which is dominated by big money, wealthy campaign contributors. The Koch brothers are going to spend some $400 million in the coming campaign. And you know what? This budget is the budget of the Koch brothers. It is the budget of the billionaire class, and the American people understand it. This is a budget which will make it harder for our children to get a decent education, harder for working families to get the health care they desperately need, harder to protect the air that we breathe and the water we drink, and harder for the elderly to live out their retirement years with dignity and respect. This is not a budget, as candidate Donald Trump talked about, that takes on the political establishment. This is a budget of the political establishment. This is the Robin Hood principle in reverse. It is a budget that takes from the poor and gives to the very wealthy. During the campaign, as we'll all recall, Donald Trump told us that, quote, the rich will not be gaining at all, end quote, under his tax reform plan. Rich will not be gaining at all. But as president, the tax reform legislation Trump signed into law a few weeks ago provides 83% of the benefits to the top 1%, raises taxes on millions of middle-class families, and drives up the deficit by $1.7 trillion by the end of the decade. And if you were wondering how President Trump plans to pay for his massive tax cuts to millionaires, billionaires, and large corporations, this budget answers that question for you by breaking his campaign pledge not to cut Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. In fact, President Trump's budget would slash Medicaid by over $1.3 trillion, cut Medicare by over $500 billion, and reduce Social Security by nearly $25 billion. Mr. Chairman, as you know, Medicaid now pays for more than 2/3 of all nursing home care in our country. What happens to senior citizens who have their nursing home coverage paid for by Medicaid if that program is cut by $1.3 trillion? Think about it. People now in nursing homes with Alzheimer's, serious illnesses, massive cuts. What happens to them? What happens to their families? And it's not just seniors. Today, Medicaid covers millions of children with special needs. We are the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people, and this budget would then throw millions more people off the health insurance they have. We have an opioid epidemic that every person up here talks about every day. But when you slash Medicaid by $1 trillion, you make it infinitely harder for communities, cities, states to deal with this terrible crisis. During his campaign, Donald Trump told the American people that he was going to provide, and I quote, health insurance from everybody, end quote, with much lower deductibles. But President Trump's budget would throw an estimated 32 million people off the health care they currently have. 32 million people. And at the same time, would substantially raise premiums for older Americans. Mr. Chairman, what this budget is about is a massive transfer of wealth from working families, the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor, and the most vulnerable people in our country to the top 1% and large corporations. As a candidate, Trump said that he understood the pain that working families across the country were feeling. Well, Mr. President, you are not responding to that pain when you propose a budget that would throw over 1 million children off after-school programs. You're not a champion of working families. You're not responding to pain when your budget would kick 500,000 families out of their homes by gutting affordable housing. We have a massive crisis in affordable housing from coast to coast. This budget would make it much, much worse. You don't help working families, Mr. President or Mr. Mulvaney, by throwing more than 100,000 children off of Head Start. We need to move to universal pre-K. Every family in America should know that their kids have good quality child care. You don't throw 100,000 children off of Head Start. You don't help working families when your budget would eliminate financial aid to more than 1.5 million low-income college students. Kids are graduating school, $30,000, $40,000, $100,000 in debt. This budget makes their problems even worse. You're not a, quote, different kind of Republican by proposing a budget that would eliminate heating assistance to nearly 7 million families in this country. Let me tell the President, Mr. Mulvaney, it gets cold in Vermont and many other parts in this country. Many of our elderly people keep warm in the wintertime through the low-income heating assistance program. Don't eliminate it. Mr. Chairman, while President Trump tells us we don't have enough money to help the working people of this country, he does believe that we have enough money to provide a massive, massive, massive increase in the Pentagon, an agency of government that has not been able to do an audit, and where study after study shows us that there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in waste. So, Mr. Chairman, the good news is this budget is going nowhere. Everybody knows that. But it does indicate where Trump and his friends are coming from. And the American people have got to understand that. And we've got to stand up and say, no, these are not the priorities of this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, budgets deal with trillions of dollars and thousands of pages and words after words after words and numbers after numbers after numbers. But the truth is, as I'm sure Director Mulvaney knows, these numbers have real meaning to the lives of ordinary people. Mr. Chairman, I want to put into the record, if I might, an article from PolitiFact dated June 27th, 2017.
Without objection.
And without going into all of what the article says, it basically confirms that when you throw many millions of people off of the health insurance they have, thousands of them will die. This budget calls, once again, for the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. The estimate is that some 32 million Americans will lose their health insurance. And what study after study shows is that when you throw 32 million people off of their health insurance, tens of thousands of them will die. Will die. Director Mulvaney, tell me about the morality of a budget which supports tax breaks for billionaires, throws 32 million people off the health insurance they have, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of fellow Americans. Do you really think this is something that we should be doing in the year 2018?
Actually, I don't think it's something that we're actually doing, Senator. Again, I'm not familiar with the article that you've mentioned. My guess is that it references the CBO report regarding various Republican proposals to repeal and replace Obamacare. I do remember one of the major points of contention regarding the way the CBO scored the proposals was that it would assume that several tens of millions of people would be, to use your terminology, kicked off of health insurance by the repeal of the individual mandate. And when we drilled down into that, Senator, what we found was that the CBO assumed that if we got rid of the individual mandate, that millions of people would voluntarily give up Medicaid expansion.
Mr.
Medicaid
Director, I
coverage,
apologize.
which is
We just
simply-
don't have a whole lot of time. This
Well,
is
if you
not
wanted me to answer your question,
No,
go ahead.
and I understand the individual mandate. This goes beyond. You're proposing a cut of over $1 trillion in Medicaid. And independent analyses have indicated, we can argue about, nobody knows for sure. Is it 25 million people going to be thrown off? 30 million? I don't know, to be honest with you. You don't know. But what we do know is when you throw tens of millions of people off, they will die. Some of them will die. Studies show that thousands of them will die. And I would just suggest that in the United States of America, the only major country not to guarantee health care to all people, we should not be making a very bad situation worse by throwing tens of millions of people off of health insurance. Let me ask you another question. Mr. Director, according to Americans for Tax Fairness, the Koch brothers, the third wealthiest family in America, worth $94 billion, and a family dedicated with a few of their billionaire friends to put hundreds of millions of dollars into the coming election, will receive a tax break of up to $1.4 billion a year from the Trump tax plan. Meanwhile, this budget eliminates funding, as I indicated earlier, for the LIHEAP program that keeps almost 7 million families warm in the wintertime. And the vast majority of these families have children, or they are senior citizens, or they are people with disabilities. Explain to me the morality of a process by which we give the third wealthiest family in America, a major contributor, I might add, to the Republican Party, over $1 billion a year in tax breaks, and yet we cut a program which keeps children and the elderly warm in the winter.
Here's the morality of the LIHEAP proposal, Senator. 11,000 dead people got that benefit the last time the GAO looked at it. That's not moral. To take your money, to take my money, to take the money from the people that
11,000 people got it who shouldn't have. Correct that. But 7 million people get the program. To say that 11,000 out of 7 million, deal with that. I agree with you.
All 50 states now have individual programs designed to prevent the cutoff of utilities either during the summer in the South or the winter in the North, which is exactly what the LIHEAP program was originally designed to do.
Mulvaney, when it gets 20 below zero, I come from a state which tries to do its best. Vermont and other states around this country, including Wyoming, don't have the resources to keep people warm when it gets 20 below zero. You have just created a situation, not you, the president must take responsibility for this budget, created a situation where people will go cold, some may freeze to death, and that is not what we should be doing in America.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. I share Senator Corker's frustrations with where we are, and I think you, Mr. Chairman, have expressed similar frustrations. We have a ridiculous budget process, and as a result of that, we end up with ridiculous budgets. This budget is going no place. We all know that. It was cooked up in the laboratories of the Koch brothers and a bunch of other creepy billionaires who want to remake America in Ayn Rand's image. It is cooked up in the laboratories of polluters who want absolutely no regulation so they can despoil at will. It includes over $1 trillion in Medicaid cuts that are clearly going no place. It is completely out of step with the funding bill that the president just signed and touted. It's off by $58 billion just from the non-defense discretionary part of the funding bill that the president just signed. It knocks down HHS with a 21% cut, as opposed to the funding bill that we just passed, which has $6 billion in opioid fundings that I think Americans desperately need. The funding bill we just passed added $20 billion in infrastructure-related investments. This cuts it by $40 billion for a $60 billion delta going the wrong way on infrastructure. And part of the reason that these silly things are in here is because the process is so silly. It is completely partisan, which is why it ends up cooked up in extremist laboratories, and it's unrelated to the funding process because of its failures. We have a budget process over here that ends up producing nothing, and then we have a funding process that's led by leadership and the appropriators that ends up actually doing the work of putting the funding measures of government together. And there's virtually no relationship between the two. The budget is like a firework that goes off with a big bang, and everybody pays attention to it because it's noisy and bright, and it has zero effect on the people who actually make the decisions year in and year out on funding the government. And I think it's a shame. And I think the signals that this is wrong are, first of all, that there's no bipartisanship whatsoever. That's been a problem for a long time. It's a vehicle for one party to express its political persuasion, to express its loyalty to its big funders, and to create a path for another purely partisan vote using the reconciliation measure. That's basically all it accomplishes. A budget process that worked would also look at tax expenditures. More money goes out the back door of the tax code than gets spent through most of these appropriations, and yet we don't look at that. The healthcare expenditure of the country, of the federal government, in the 10-year out period has been estimated to have fallen by about $3 trillion. That's a big number, and we don't know why. I think it has something to do with ACOs and with payment reform and with changes in treatment by doctors at the local level that are actually driving down per patient year-over-year costs, but we don't know that. We ought to be vitally interested in trying to figure out why we got that $3 trillion and how we can make more of it if we're getting it by better patient care. My God, what could be more important than improving patient care and lowering costs at the same time instead of going after preposterous cuts? We have to have the budget have some parliamentary effect if it's going to be meaningful. Right now, the budget has zero parliamentary effect because the 60-vote penalty is the 60-vote minimum for appropriations. So we're shooting blanks. We have absolutely no effect here. We are a null factor. And finally, we got to look at revenues. I know it's torture for our Republican friends to look at revenues sometimes, but for crying out loud, we cannot have passion about deficits and then at the same time abandon our passion about deficits as soon as it runs up against the carried interest exception that protects the biggest billionaires on Wall Street. We cannot maintain a passion for deficits that evaporates as soon as it bumps up against tax benefits for big oil, for crying out loud, the companies that need the least tax relief of any companies in the world. And yet, there is this magic disappearing passion about deficits when they bump up against some very obvious ways to raise revenue. Now, we each have our own politics on either side to bring to this, and we can keep ricocheting back and forth from one extreme to the other, but until and unless we have a meaningful bipartisan process that actually looks at tax expenditures and takes a responsible look at what's going on in healthcare so that we can reduce costs without cutting benefits, and looks at revenues and has some parliamentary effect, all we're doing here is noise-making and firing off fireworks into the sky that people look at and think, oh, that must be really interesting. Look what this budget just did. And in fact, everybody who's in on the scheme knows that it has no effect whatsoever, and the appropriators and the leaders are going to get together and make a deal like they just did, and that is how this is going to continue. We have got, Mr. Chairman, to fix our broken budget process, and one of the best things in the recent funding bill that we just passed was to set up a bicameral committee to take a look at how we solve a broken process. The way to a budget that works is the path of bipartisanship. We have to create such a road, and here endeth my statement. Thank you, Chairman. And by the way, I sincerely appreciate your leadership on this particular question. You may not agree with every word that I said, but I think we have common cause in believing that the budget process needs reform and improvement. And I appreciate your leadership in moving us in that direction.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Senator Murray.
Thank you, Chairman Enzi. Now, before I turn to Director Mulvaney, I do want to comment on the new Joint Select Committee on Budget and appropriations process that was included in the budget caps deal. I expect we'll be hearing a lot about that in the coming months, and I just want to make my views very clear. Republicans spent 2017 hijacking the budget process for two things. First of all, a partisan attempt to take health care away from millions of families, which thankfully crashed and burned. And second, jamming through the massive tax cut for the wealthiest Americans and a permanent tax cut for the biggest corporations without even trying to work with Democrats on ways we could help the middle class. Now, in 2018, things have been a little different. Republicans came to the table and worked with us on a 2-year budget deal that increased investments in education and health care and child care and other domestic and military priorities. Now, finally, the Appropriations Committee has clarity and we are able to get to work and pass our bills by the March deadline. So with all due respect to Chairman Enzi and my House and Senate Republican colleagues, we don't need a new select committee to tell us what the problem is. It's pretty obvious. This budget committee has been unable or unwilling to do its job. So we had to lurch into one crisis and then another before the rest of Congress could come together and clean up a mess. I'm hoping we can do our jobs on the Appropriations Committee, and I continue to hope that this committee can do its job and not rely on new select committees that are intended to pass the buck instead of making the tough calls, and I just wanted to make that clear. Director Mulvaney, if this were a normal budget hearing, I would start off by commenting that budgets are statements of values and priorities, and I would dig into the various proposals, what they said about what kind of country we were, what kind of country we wanted to be. If this were a normal budget committee, I would point out that the so-called immigration proposals it includes are wasteful, divisive. I'd point out that it is widely misguided and simply wrong to ask low-income families and the workers who need a hand up to bear the brunt of massive cuts while trillions are being spent on tax cuts for the rich and while austerity flies out the window when it comes to the military. If this were a normal budget committee hearing, I would point out how absurd it is to cut $200 billion in financial aid for college while students are struggling to afford college and keep their heads above water. And I'd point out serious concern about this administration's request for veterans care. You know, if this were a normal budget committee, I may even praise some of the attention that's finally being paid to tackling the opioid crisis. But Director Mulvaney, this is anything but a normal budget and budget committee hearing. President Trump just signed a 2-year budget agreement into law that makes this request irrelevant. Democrats and Republicans have ignored President Trump's budget request before in the interest of trying to get something done, and this one will be no different. So it seems this budget proposal is only good for one thing, reminding people across the country that President Trump cares more about giving tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations than he does about investing in health care and education and child care and middle-class priorities. So, Director Mulvaney, for years I've heard you rail against deficit spending. You called yourself a deficit hawk. You claimed to take our debt very seriously. You called for balanced budget amendments. You said our debt is, quote, so large as to defy description. Well, the debt's only grown since. The deficit has increased under this administration, approaching $1 trillion this year and next. And it can't, quote, defy description because you describe it in the pages of this budget proposal. And don't even try to hold yourself to the standard you held President Obama to when you were a member of Congress. So I was prepared to come here today and call you out on the hypocrisy, but then I heard you on Sunday that if you were in Congress, you would have voted against the budget legislation that President Trump just signed. So I wanted to give you a chance today to step back from the hypocrisy. If you were in Congress, would you have voted for this budget that you're presenting?
Sure, and I give the same answer I gave on Sunday, which is that as a member of Congress representing the 5th District of South Carolina, I probably would have found enough shortcomings in this to vote against it, as did many members of this committee. But I'm the director of the Office of Management and Budget. My job is to try and fund the president's priorities, which is exactly what we did.
So you would say this is a no as a member of Congress?
Yeah, I think I've said that before.
Okay.
I don't think that reflects on my opinion of it as a member of the administration.
Okay. Well, let me ask you one more
I'm
question.
just trying to give an honest question to an
I
honest answer,
appreciate it.
Senator.
I appreciate it. Republicans have busted our budget with trillions in tax cuts for the rich, and this budget starts asking the middle class to actually pay for that. You have said before that you would like to cut Social Security and Medicare. Can you commit to me today that you will not be asking for a penny of cuts to benefits from either of these critical programs in future budgets to pay for the president's tax cuts?
And that's exactly what this budget reflects. The proposals that you see that touch on Social Security do not deal with old age retirement benefits, do not deal with core Social Security, as we discussed last year. We try to address some reforms within Social Security disability insurance.
What do you propose?
I think, well, in Medicare, for example, let's talk about Medicare, because that was the other thing you asked. We do not propose any changes to any benefits, any services to beneficiaries. We try to focus on lowering drug prices within Medicare. The number I've heard, by the way, a couple times today and in the press is that we propose to cut Medicare by $500 billion, $500 billion. That's just not right. The number is $236 billion, and most of that is tied up in drug reforms and some other proposals. For example, Senator Bryan, thank you for the time to do this, but I don't know if you know this or not, but your Medicare money that you pay in FICA that goes into the Medicare Trust Fund actually goes to pay for graduate medical school tuition. It goes to pay for bad debts from non-Medicare patients at hospitals. And we propose to move that.
Are you eliminating that?
We do actually move that onto another part of the budget.
Really?
So that we actually still pay those, but we don't pay them out of the trust fund. And a lot of folks have said, well, that's a cut to Medicare. No, it's not. It's actually improving the Medicare Trust Fund, and I think the proposals.
Somewhere else where you can cut it. Okay,
Yeah.
I got it, and we're out of time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Under Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have cuts in this budget, just can take 4 line items, health and Medicare and higher ed and food, that is SNAP, and there's 1.5 trillion right there. So, you know, big outline for America. Let's give 1.5 trillion in tax bill to the wealthiest Americans and proceed to cut our health, our commitment to our seniors on health as well, cut the affordability of college because, you know, the rich are okay, they can pay their college. Don't worry about the rest of Americans. And oh, and by the way, the hungry in America, too bad. Let those children go hungry. They're from poor families, they don't matter. What kind of a message does this send about this administration that said they're going to work for working families? Going to address the challenges of living wage jobs and health and education. And right here, health and education get hit enormously, the foundations for families to thrive. Or we can take some other, there's more cuts than that. How about the $3.4 billion to heating and the offset of a tax cut to Wells Fargo of the same amount? What's more important, Mr. Director? The heating program or the tax cut to Wells Fargo, which has defrauded so many hundreds of thousands of people across this country? Which one's more important to you?
Actually, Senator, I'm familiar with the $3.39 billion in LIHEAP. I think I addressed that earlier with Senator Sanders. I'm happy to review it if you like. I'm not at all familiar.
I'm just asking which one's more important to you, the cut to heating or the tax cut to Wells Fargo, which has defrauded so many people?
Senator, I'd have to challenge the.
Yeah, I've noticed you never answer questions from Democrats, so I'm not expecting you to answer, but I thought I'd give you the chance. Or how about the $4.3 billion cut to rental assistance? We have people living on the streets and the cloverleafs and the underpasses all across America because the cost of housing over the last 4 decades has gone up enormously compared to living wage. But you want to do a $4.3 billion cut in rental assistance while giving $6 billion to ExxonMobil. Which is more important to you?
Actually,
people having housing or $6 billion ExxonMobil? Which one?
One of the things I mentioned during my opening
It's a
statement,
choice of the
Senator,
two. You can answer one way or the other. I think the public would like to know.
It is, but I don't like to answer loaded questions that are simply rhetorical and may not be correct. I'm not even sure that $4.3 billion number is right.
That is the amount in your budget, and you should be aware of that when you
in my opening
testify
statement
here. Let's turn to something about the after-school programs, the STEM programs, our ability to undertake high-tech advancements in our economy. You've got about $1 billion to $1.4 billion to the Koch brothers and $1.2 billion reduction in after-school STEM programs. Which is more important, educating our children or more money for the Koch brothers?
And again, I can't even see that part of your.
Do you think the
graph.
Koch brothers consider it a good investment that they say they'll spend $400 million in the next election, and then they get you to give them a $1.4 billion reduction in their taxes?
Again,
That's pretty good
Senator,
investment for the Koch brothers?
Yeah, I have no clue where that $1.4 billion range comes from, or if it's accurate.
Or how about Chevron getting $2 billion while you cut development assistance by $2.8 billion? Everything we see in this budget is about help to the powerful and an assault on working Americans. And I hear a whole lot of bragging about, oh, we're going to help lower income Americans with a tax cut, but you put a provision into the tax bill that will wipe out health care for 13 million people and raise health premiums more than 10% next year for the rest. That in itself wipes out any gains from the tax bill. I'm really disappointed to see that the philosophy this administration ran on of fighting for ordinary Americans became just, this is an administration by and for the powerful and about undermining the opportunity for ordinary families to thrive. Now let's turn to your other role. You seem to take great pleasure in having wiped out the payday loan rule and allow interest rates of 500 to 1,000%, far more than the mafia ever charged. Why is that a good thing for America?
Senator, I think it's inaccurate to say that we've wiped out the payday rule. We've simply given notice that we're going to take additional comments on additional rulemaking.
Did you or did you not suspend implementation of the payday rule?
Again, we gave notice that the payday rule, as far as I know, is still in effect. We've simply given notice that we are going to take additional comment for additional rulemaking.
You delayed it. You can call it whatever you want, but you prevented it from going into effect. I'm not sure why you're dancing around about it, because you seem pretty happy about having done so to help out these payday loan companies charging 500 to 1,000%.
I'm sorry, was there a question there, Senator?
Yeah. The question is, when you're so happy about having helped out the payday loan companies, why don't you own it now? Why do you want to dodge the question?
Again, Senator, we've given notice that we're going to take additional comments for additional rulemaking.
How about Equifax? Millions of Americans, 143 million Americans, lost the integrity of their data, and you just let them off the hook.
I can
no
tell
accountability. How about accountability? How about that concept being embedded in the work of what was our consumer watchdog that now is our consumer rollover and let the big companies scratch its belly organization?
On Equifax, I can tell you, Senator, that there's been no change in the position of the previous leadership of CFPB regarding Equifax.
Yeah, okay. All right. If you're going to make these decisions, you might as well own them and defend them. Thanks.
Thank you.
I would mention that if anybody has any additional questions, the questions can be submitted for the record by 6 p.m. today with the signed hard copy delivered to the clerk at Dirksen 624. Then you'll have up to 7 days to respond to those questions to get additional good information so that we can understand this budget as well as we can so that we can do our budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Outstanding presentation. Adjourned.